Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Destination Big Leagues. In today's episode, I've got Peter Stepnek. Peter Stepnek is the co founder of Next Zone and Macromo. Thank you so much for coming on to the podcast, Peter. Really appreciate it.
Hi, Ronak. Thanks for having me here.
Okay, so a quick brief about you. So NextZone is an hardware incubator and a co-working space based in Prague, and a Macromo is basically you're basically trying to reinvent the way people track their health and take accountability of their health. It's super fascinating. It's very rare that you see people that tend to work in deep tech, and you're doing that. I feel like a lot of smart people tend to take the easy route, get into SaaS and finance. But I always appreciate when I come across someone trying to build in deep tech, because because it truly does change the world. Some of the stuff that you guys build. So I know that you've got a great history as a builder from a childhood. Uh, could you run the audience through your journey into being a builder and a creator?
Yeah. It basically all started for me when I was around like 12 years old, in around what probably the US audience would call middle school, I guess, but still back in Czech Republic. Um, and I was very fascinated by biology and how nature works. I had my own little lab at home with a hobby microscope and even a little chemical lab, but there's actually a big gap between such a hobby lab you can have at home when you're young or even when you're older, and the actual real lab which the big companies use to do the latest research. And after, running some small experiments myself, after a couple of years, I run out of the ideas of what to do with this inferior equipment. So this is actually what led me first to hardware because I wanted to upgrade my lab equipment. So I actually started going to scrapyards because I was like any young student, kind of low on cash, and I needed to find ways to get through some parts. And the first thing I remember what I needed to build was to build a 3D printer and then a centrifuge, which I didn't have any access to. So yeah, I basically started visiting every weekend scrapyard, so where I made a deal with the owners that I will disassemble some old electronics for them, keeping the scrap metal what they want on the side and keeping all the electronics and the functional parts like motors, PCBs for me to repurpose. And this way I built my very own 3D printer when I was 15. And then, yeah, really started on tinkering with all of that.
Awesome. So you've been a true inventor from the early ages. So when did you start your first business and what was it?
Yeah, I started right after going to high school. The system is a little bit different than the US. Listeners might know we were actually um, our elementary and middle school are combined together into one like 9-year-old school, and then we go to a completely different like city usually, and it's already a specialized school. So my school was already specialized into informatics and tech, and there I met my co-founder, who was 2 years older at the time, and he was, an avid skateboard rider, whereas I was the tech guy. Uh, and we come up with the idea to build the first electric skateboards company in Czech Republic. So we started ordering all kinds of parts online, OEM manufactured parts from Alibaba, and we started assembling it all together in his garage and selling it. We eventually got to the large distributors and started selling tens of pieces every month. Actually, I had to go through a legal process to make me eligible to hold shares in a company because if you're less than 18 years old in my country, you cannot do that. So I had to go to a court and justify why I'm like, kind of like they call it like mature enough, that you can be a shareholder or a co-founder. So I had to go through all of that. and we eventually scaled the company to becoming one of the largest manufacturers in Central Europe. And yeah, that's actually got me to my trip in China later, where I needed to, cut all the middlemen we had in our supply chain and really optimize what we were building with electric skateboards.
Awesome. I mean, I remember being super fascinated with electric skateboards. This was the time when I was in university, and I started watching this YouTuber called Casey Neistat. You might know
Yeah.
him. He used to ride around the boosted board all over New York City, and it just seemed so cool. Uh, I've never owned one, but I
Yeah.
had friends that, and I think it was so awesome. I feel like a lot of people at that point were thinking about just short-term mobility. I remember the hoverboards and all those things that came out. But that's a pretty cool first company to build, and seeing kind of the hurdles that you had to go through, kind of interesting. What did you learn about like, supply chain and dealing with OEM manufacturers? Like, what did you learn during that process?
Well, at first it kind of seemed easy, but I would call it. I think it's somehow falsely named to be the Dunning-Kruger effect, where you're basically, reaching that pinnacle of your, of not actually knowing much, but thinking that you know everything. So this is where we were when we were building it while still in Europe. But then we actually realized that we won't be able to scale it much more. We will not cut out, as I said, all the middlemen, because we were buying, for example, batteries from European manufacturers, which weren't actually manufacturers. They were sort of reselling that. So the supply chain wasn't very optimized, and I really needed to make some move, to change that. And right after I turned 18, or literally the day after I turned 18, it was in 20,000, like 2018, sorry. Um, the day after I applied for a Chinese business visa because I knew that there are a lot of suppliers in China with whom I could cooperate on that. And they told me at the embassy that I'm probably the youngest holder of it this year. And and yeah, I blindly, went off to China, thinking that it's gonna be easy to find all the factories there. It actually turned out to be like two things didn't go exactly like according to the plan. Like China is super huge, that's one thing. Second thing, I really underestimated how few people speak English and how that like little group of people who are actually building businesses and hardware stores there can hide in the millions and tens of millions of people in an average Chinese city. I was in Shenzhen, which is basically the core city, I would call, like the best place to build some like consumer hardware and to scale it, or it was at the time, definitely, when I was there, like, 6 years ago. And I thought it's gonna be much easier, so I tried applying. I actually realized that the best way would be to go to some hardware incubators, but I tried applying to those, but they all declined me, that I was there in the middle of the application periods. They have like winter and summer. I was there during the spring, so they would, just kick me out right away. And so I didn't really know what to do, and my co-founder was there with me too. And one day, one thing which was totally unprecedented and random just happened. We were in the McDonald's. There's actually a McDonald's in China, and it was actually one of the few places we knew how to order food at, because as nobody talked English and didn't even understand like really the simplest words, um, then basically the only way how you could order something was to take your phone, take a photo of the menu, and circle it there uh, on your screen, and
Right.
try to somehow communicate how many pieces of that you want. So, and during that time, when I was again ordering in McDonald's, some Indian guy approached to me and offered me his help, offered us of his help, like, can I help you to order? Like, you look kind of new here, and we pitched him in like an elevator pitch because he was asking what we are doing here, two young guys in the middle of Shenzhen, um, working on startup. So we pitched him our idea, and he basically told us, I know a guy who might help you. Um, just call him, and he wrote down to a piece of paper a Chinese phone number. And just, and he was in a hurry, so he then ran away. We didn't get his contact ever again. And so we tried calling that number, and you know how the guy on the other side introduced himself? He introduced himself as Hank as the troublemaker here. So I was thinking like, oh no, we don't want to trouble. It's nice to meet you, Hank. But actually, you know what? It turned out to be that Hank was a founder of a startup incubator accelerator called the Troublemaker, which is in the center of Shenzhen, helping exactly founders like us to, you know, get into the local community. And this kind of like fast tracked us through all the applications, and we became members of his incubator. Um, and through him, we got to know all the suppliers, and this is really the like the break even point of the supply chain that we were building, because from then on we were able to get to the best factories which were proven, reviewed by the other founders, and we could prototype. And basically the biggest changing point was, at the time we were already into developing our own customized products, not just assembling OEM parts. And um we like, just to compare, the contrast between how fast a similar process took in Europe versus there. It took us only 3 to 4 days to build a full prototype, fully new prototype. um, Whereas in Europe, comparably, it would took us 3 to 4 weeks, not days, because the proximity to all the suppliers. I remember, being there, drafting some schematics of an electric motor, discussing right, in the factory with their engineer, and then the second day after, like right the day after, they manufactured my design of a waterproof electric motor for the skateboard. That was so fast, like I've never seen before. In Europe, I would probably have problems with like MOQ, like minimum order
Yeah.
quantity. Like, yeah, they will be all like telling me, "Yeah, it's like maybe we could put it in the queue, but like it's just like 2 or 3 pieces prototype. We don't really do that. You'll have to wait a month. They were so eager to help anytime. That's what I like there.
Right. I mean, that's awesome that you guys made the decision to actually go to China, the heart of manufacturing, especially in Shenzhen. I believe that Foxconn is in Shenzhen, right? Like the Apple manufacturing supplier.
I believe so. Like, there are a lot of consumer electronics. Like overall, you know, I I think that if you're building some consumer product at the time in 2018, it was the best place. I don't know how it's actually now because I haven't been building there since then, but at the time it was really the best place to, and I still believe, for any kind of consumer product, mm, it's somewhere where you can scale it, because imagine like just a comparison, all plastic parts, basically all plastic parts you want to include in your products, anything that's plastic needs a mold. Such a mold, if you want to get it manufactured in Germany, can run 3 to 4 times higher in price than in China. And obviously, yeah, it is better. It has higher quality and it can last for millions of pieces. Yeah, where you're molding parts, injecting plastic basically into it to build your product. But if you're a startup, do you really want to invest into something which you need, for millions, and hardware startup, which needs to iterate a lot on the design, so you either have to stick to 3D printing, but then there is like this, gap, between manufacturing techniques where a lot of 3D printing techniques can cover later like small runs, But then you have the molds for like multi-million pieces runs and large investments, and there's like a gap. Like some luckily some technologies have filled in this gap. Some advanced 3D printing technologies, especially lately. But still, this is something which is totally solvable, where you can buy lower quality molds in Asia and manufacture there. They will probably break down, after 100,000 of pieces, but for a startup, that's more than enough.
Totally. I think China just moves and operates really quick. And I guess like in terms of quality as well, I guess you can get every variance of quality, right, in China. Like, I mean, the iPhone is
Yeah,
one of the best built phones are built in China, and you get some of the worst built products. It just really is upon the price range that you're willing to pay.
exactly. And I think, one thing which I would, or I don't know if it was only my personal observation, but the way how to make the deals is also very different. You really need to be there and be there yourself, physically present, and watch over the production continuously. Because then it might actually, because what I learned is that they don't want to raise prices. They are a bit like, afraid to disappoint you. So even if some higher costs at their side come in, they aren't really raising prices, but they would instead lower the quality. So do you really need to watch for that? And also, if for advice for any fellow hardware founders who are gonna try like build something there, um, oftentimes what I experience myself is that they never tell you no. They either tell you always yes, and then two things can happen. They actually do it, or the second thing which can happen, they will ghost you. A lot of the factories. It's like a weird, I think, behavior that we're not really used to here in US and Europe, but certainly
Right.
did happen to us.
Right. So that's super interesting, right? A 15-year-old and a 17-year-old choose to start up a hardware company, a skateboarding company based on their hobby and passion. One being a skateboarder, the other being someone who's into just building. And you guys go to China, figure out how to cut costs, how to scale this. That's actually quite commendable. Talk about, your future journey as a builder. How did what were the next subsequent things that you built after this?
I came back to Prague after spending a couple of months in China, and I really missed that space, which was called Troublemaker in Shenzhen, founded by the Dutch guy. And I wanted to create a similar space because there was really an underserved need in Prague for um, founders who were trying to prototype and build, especially very early on, where in hardware you need access to a lot of tools, 3D printers, CNC machines, um, which you just cannot, like invest in yourself. Um, and there were some maker spaces, but I would more like call those like spaces for hobbyists. But what I really wanted to bring to Prague was exactly what I experienced in China. It's like having access to the large machines for actual small scale production and prototyping. And that's exactly what I started to build right afterwards. Um, Together with a friend, we designed or like we created a 3D virtual reality model, and we were walking around in 2019 with a very bulky laptop and HTC Vive, something like that, a bit outdated VR headset currently. And we were, going to pitch that to investors. Uh, we did a 3D scan of an old brownfield, basically three old workshops and used like industrial halls in the center of Prague. And we pitched that we were going to reconstruct them into Next Zone, the first hardware startup incubator in the Czech Republic, which is going to kickstart so many new projects. And we actually succeeded in raising for that. And subsequently in 2020, we opened the doors to our makerspace, where we equip it with the most professional equipment. And I often like to call it that it's the space for those who uh, are not afraid of big things, you know. So we had teams building their liquid fuel rocket engines, um, large prototypes, welding large constructions, um, all kinds of like projects in renewables, for example, which require a lot of space to be built, and similar things like that in like automotive or aerospace. So that's where we focused on mainly. And then the space also includes an event hall where we are trying to facilitate all kinds of networking. And it's really important, because what I observed from similar makerspaces was that, um, especially if you target on very early on startup founders, you cannot charge them too much, but you obviously need money to keep the space running, right? Because maintaining all that equipment costs a lot. So actually, we found a very clever workaround by creating an event space which can itself be rented in the center of Prague for commercial partners, but also offered to a lot of non-profit organizations and student groups just for the costs. So it's fully booked every day. And this generates enough income to subsidize the operations of the makerspace. And thus, we are the only hardware incubator who does not need to dilute the founders and can fully support them with just minimal fees. And at the same time, we don't need any kind of long-term supporters. We don't need to include, I don't know, commercials and to some companies on every event, because we are basically build this self-sustaining cycle. Um, and it brings, the event space also brings so many new people into the community every day that it facilitates a very healthy style of networking, which is seen never anywhere else, where, you cannot build the next big thing if you're gonna be just putting together in one building a homogeneous community of hardware builders. You need to, similar like I met my friend then and we started the hardware company. I was the hardware guy, he was the business guy. If I never met a business guy, I would have probably still be tinkering by now, and I would probably be some scientist, right? So that was a transformative experience, which I also wanted to build into the whole operations and how the whole space works every day.
Totally. I think with hardware, right? It's unlike software where you could sit in your home, you could sit in your attic, and you can potentially solo maybe build a $1 billion company on your own, right? Yeah, it's probably not going to be too far from where like someone builds $1 billion company or a multi-million. I mean, people have already done multi-million-dollar companies, you know. But hardware really needs community, right? Because it's very rare that you see great hardware being built by a solo entrepreneur. There's a whole sort of supply chain and a whole operation of people that need to kind of touch hands, right, to really build great hardware. Uh, uh, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and like, I often say that we are, as hardware designers, we are fighting with the physics itself and the world. We're not, you know, coding in an environment created by humans. Um, so there are a lot of variables which we just cannot expect. Like one really short example. Then, right during building Next Zone, I also started a second startup where we were building like small alarm clocks, which were smart, and helping people to. The biggest advantage of them was helping people to stick to healthier sleeping habits by keeping their phone away from their bedroom. So it had an app, but this small alarm clock, it seemed to be kind of simple, right? On the outside, it has some light, some speaker, it connects to your phone, but on the inside, actually the first two versions had a problem that they were overheating, but because it had a real like stylish wooden body made from real piece of oak. And the consumer would not think about that. That's such a small, low power thing could overheat, but we're like, as I said, we're playing with physics. When you enclose something into a piece of wood, and you just need a lot of experience. So really having access to peers from hardware who gone through all of that, and that's one thing is building a prototype, but really the best designs are the designs which are scalable, which unfortunately nowadays, when I'm mentoring still, like, or unfortunately I'm now fully into bioinformatics, but when I was mentoring, a lot of hardware builders at MechZone, I often saw that the latest techniques, like having easy access to 3D printing, is actually making the initial steps really simple, because basically what you can think of, you can print it, right? There are very few constraints. But then I often see a big gap, between what is 3D printable and what is actually manufacturable using the large scalable techniques like injection molding, uh, or like, subtractive manufacturing, basically machining of parts. Where a lot of hardware founders nowadays just don't have the experience in that, and never really have a place to try it, and that's what we're offering them.
Totally. Like 3D printing really enables you to prototype and, play with your product, in a tangible manner. You don't have to conceptualize it and pass it to a manufacturer and then get it months later to like sort of test it. You can right away test it. But, like the reality is that 3D printing today is not that scalable relative to, the traditional manufacturing methods. And I think that's probably the buffer that happens, because there's one thing of 3D printing and conceptualizing it, and then the manufacturing challenge. I always say, like, listen to Elon Musk talk about this, right? He's like, yeah, it's easy to build a car. It's easy to build one car, but Tesla's greatest innovation is their manufacturing plant. It's the gigafactory. That is the greatest piece of innovation, that they're able to push out so many cars. You know, uh, and because manufacturing is not a sexy field. It's a very, very hard and laborious field. Not a lot of people want to go into manufacturing. There's a lot of more attractive fields to get into. So, I really, I mean, I've never like dealt in manufacturing, but I've consumed enough content and read a lot about it to understand, and sympathize with some of the things that you were mentioning, with the challenges of moving things into production, moving things into, you know, scale. So,
Yeah, like a lot of things have to align at, the perfect time to get assembled, and then you're running into shortages of components. And like, what's the worst thing which we run into a couple of times? Imagine you have a whole product of, imagine like 20 different major parts, but then you have the PCB, just the electronics, and it has another 100 small tiny components on it. And imagine just one of that components is out of stock. If you won't find a substitute, your whole supply chain is stopped. And which is actually something which was happening, or a lot of people heard about it, about the chips, running short on chips, or we used to, but still it's still kind of in the air, raising prices of a lot of stuff. So this can exactly happen to any hardware founder, and you just need to be prepared. So that's also the way how you build stuff. When you're designing electronics, you need to keep in mind that you need to be working with parts which are readily available and replaceable if the need arises. And I've seen so many designs where founders ordered 500 pieces, of some electronics, but then wanted to order more, but eventually they bought out the whole stock, you know, of some specific part which they chose, even though they would have a different part with just a little, like, I don't know, size difference, or something which is uh, doesn't really make much of a difference, but it's 100 times more available and in stock all the time. So that's
right.
all you need to watch out for.
Right. So I guess the takeaway for people building sort of physical products is make sure that within the supply chain you don't have a single point of failure in terms of all the parts and components. You have alternative parts just in case you're not able to procure a certain part. And the other thing would probably be is work with multiple suppliers to make sure in case one supplier is not able to fulfill or comply with your purchase order, you can go to an alternate supplier so you don't delay your production.
Yeah, exactly. The redundancy is really important, but not in the very first stages, but investors are gonna ask about it.
Totally. Okay. So, the skateboarding company, the co-working space, the hardware incubator, and now you're currently sitting in San Francisco. You founded this company called Macromo, and you're basically trying to reinvent the way people interact with their health. Uh, talk about talk about this journey because I think this is going to be a super noble one. Uh, uh, talk about how you got into starting this company.
Yeah, like to maybe quickly summarize what we're doing is that nowadays people don't want to be sick. They never wanted to be sick, but we're increasingly seeing a trend that people are actively trying to watch their health and track it, but they have an overload of all kinds of devices, apps, choices, decisions to make, which puts them into really a strong paralysis of what should be the next best step I should do in terms of my even everyday habits, prevention, or what's my current health status? People are asking questions like these, even though they might have, like as many variable trackers as I do, it actually even makes the situation worse because you're having so many apps. And what we're building, we're unifying all of that into comprehensible and easy to understand actionable feed of information. So we take in your DNA test results if you have these at hand, all your blood tests, which you can easily scan with your phone, variables data, your medical docs, and we are storing it for you, and then building on top of that your personalized feed for you for every day, where you can track habits and action steps to improve in the selective area of your focus. One day it might be reducing your stress if you're in some stressful period, and will guide you with evidence-based motivation, which really makes the change much more impactful. Around like 60 to 70% of our users have reported to have been trying a lot of different self-improvement programs and habit trackers before coming to us, but actually failed again, like the similar percentage, like around 60% failed because of the loss of accountability, feeling that it's not personalized enough, that they're basically just getting generic recommendations, and they don't really know how to relate to that. So that's verbal bullying. And the whole story, how I got into it, is really in my research previously, where after starting Next Zone, I wanted to go back to my original passion. My path was, I was younger, into biology. Then I kind of like took a detour to hardware, and I kind of like wanted to come back to that passion from my youth. So I thought, as I had to make the choice to go to a university, that pursuing something in the field of bioinformatics or biomedical engineering would make the biggest sense. And I wanted to push myself even more because I was never the one who was like doing software and coding. I always had co-workers, team members working on my firmware for the electronics and hardware I was designing. So I actually eventually chose bioinformatics with focus on genomics. And during that time, I worked. I sequenced my genome and started playing with all the data, and then I got an idea to my research, which was focused on Wilson's disease, which is basically a disease of accumulation of copper. The metal, where in every food and drink we consume, there's a little tiny amount of different metals and minerals, and copper is one of those. And in those Wilson disease patients, it accumulates in their livers until a point where it becomes too much and the liver functions like drops really fast. But it's kind of hard to judge, because in some people it develops, when they are 15 years old. In some people, when they are 40 years old, sometimes it never develops at all. And there's a huge discrepancy between the people who should have it based on their genetics, which was once thought to be the only causal factor, and what those who actually have it. So I was building um, machine learning algorithms to unify all kinds of biomarkers. And this kind of like brings me to the idea of Macromo, right? I was unifying so-called like minimally invasive biomarkers like blood tests, urine analysis, even images of your irises, because interesting things is that if you're having this copper accumulating in your body, you don't have to be actually scared. It's like it's like 1 in 40,000 people, so it's actually really rare. But it can actually create rings, which are called Kaiser-Fleischer rings in your irises, cause discoloration there, which is trackable by ML or a very skilled ophthalmologist, basically. Um, and tying all of that, could eventually be used to replace the only known diagnostic procedure to track the progress of accumulation of copper, which is invasive liver biopsy. Imagine taking a thick needle and taking a piece of your liver, which needs to be done usually in anesthesia, and it's really not something which can be done routinely. Um, but it offers a direct measure of the copper in liver. I was replacing that with a combination of other biomarkers, which themselves weren't like sensitive or specific enough to diagnose Wilson disease in itself. And this led me, together with like fighting my own health problem. At the time, I was also like, having a problem which was kind of like multifactorial, and even taking medications for it. I was able to combining this approach, building like a complete health profile about my own health, um, with how I exercise, what are my risk factors, what are my blood test measurements, and one doctor was able to, with this, you know, um, treasure trove of information I provided to her, actually found the problem which I had, and I was able to get off medication, get so much improved. So these two things which happened to me at coincidentally the same time frame led me to the idea to build this, but for way more people, to make this approach to your own health accessible. And that's why I reached out to the two best founders, repeat founders who I knew at the time. One of them is Eva, my co-founder, who at the time was working in here in Silicon Valley for DoorDash and ClickUp. Um, and she was, a senior product designer at the age like mine. I'm 23. She's a year older than me. And then I reached out also to Michael, whom I knew from my research work at then like the Charles University in Prague, and the linked, the hospital where I was working with actual Wilson disease patients. Um, and his background is also fabulous. He built the fastest growing university spin-off in Central Europe, making like $25 million in the first year because they had a very unique technology, deep tech technology, which they were able to successfully spin off from the university to practice. So this is our founders team, and that's what we're building right now. Applying my research into practice through a consumer-facing app. So we
Right.
probably took the two hardest challenges. Deep tech and a consumer tech.
Totally. I think this is a super challenging task. I mean, you're in the US. I know how hard it is for doing anything and getting FDA approvals to, getting into the healthcare space. But I love the mission. I love the mission because you're essentially creating a digital health footprint. And I feel that today the biggest gap in the healthcare space is essentially that gap of data. We have now as the costs of wearable technologies are reducing, people sort of wearing it more often, but there is not one unified platform that sort of gives you all your data in a way of a 360 profiling. And the fact that you're doing it just makes it better for GPs and physicians to really have a more sort of a comprehensive approach in terms of what diagnosis to give you. Because I'm not sure of the statistics, but I know, like, you go to a doctor, they take a certain unidimensional test, and they give you sort of a misdiagnosis, but or they haven't really looked at your, I don't know, your eye information or your glucose level or something like that. So having that 360 profile, and then just internally studying the data as well and seeing, like, hey, if you're of this genetic type of group and you're of this age, you're more likely to face XYZ diseases. If you've lived in XYZ, there's so much sort of big data analysis and clever algorithms that you can use to sort of analyze and sort of be proactive. I feel like one of the big problems in the US is sort of a reactive healthcare system, right? You wait for something to go wrong, you wait for the system to crash, and then you start trying to fix it. And I feel like you guys are taking the step of being proactive, controlling your health, which is amazing. Talk about some interesting insights that you've kind of derived just collecting all of this 360 profile healthcare.
Um, well, I maybe like first I'll shortly elaborate, with like the 360 profile. Apple Health is, for example, really close to building a very, like unified storage, but they never really take the step further, to basically give you the recommendations. And that's the issue, we see them more like a catalyst to our success than somebody who would be a competitor, and like often people ask me like, so it's like Apple Health. No, it's like, a step further, because Apple Health cannot include most of your imported blood test results or DNA test results and won't give you the next action steps. And the insights, well, apart from that, we have already data sets for, around, it depends on the specific data type, but in some cases we have hundreds of thousands of samples. In some cases we only have a few thousand at first. And um, certainly, like we got into some interesting correlations, which very much agree with what studies are also discovering when it comes to a lot of chronic diseases. But actually, if you think about it, it's not this correlation or risk that the user wants to know. It's not going to be in any way motivational for most of the users if you were to tell them, and just take this as an example, according to our advanced statistics, in 5 years and 25 days, you will probably be diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. This is not something what the person wants to hear. It's something that we do build on the backside. We're trying to make, um, the predictions, which is something which is gonna help eventually your GP, to make better informed decisions. But what is important for the end user are the actual atomic habits to improve. So I would say that everybody can start somewhere, and that's the biggest insight. There is always some step which you can do, and just about what is the next best step for you, and that's what we're exactly building. So you imagine like you really want to do something, but again, the second issue is that a lot of people are kind of like losing the momentum. You're going to your doctor, you usually spend, the average appointment is like 15-20 minutes. The doctor doesn't really have enough time to explain you your results. Everybody's so much into their health and tracking and listening to a lot of podcasts, top trending podcasts among health, and wants to actually learn what's my, I don't know, ApoB level, or my LDL cholesterol, what it means. But the doctor doesn't really have time to explain it to you. So then you're left with a lot of questions which are unanswered, and then the doctor also doesn't have the time to be like your health coach. And then imagine you're trying to get a health coach then. Usually it takes, at least a week to get an appointment. You have to go through a lot of reviews to find a really good matching health coach. And what we're building is that people will like never lose momentum like that. We're enabling that first touch point in the app. We are enabling them to import their bot test results, get them explained right in the app, and get the first action steps, which can be so simple as incorporate more leafy greens into your diet, or um, track your cholesterol in 3 months, in 3 months from now, because it's a bit higher. And in the meantime, do improve, your weight, your exercise. And here are all the steps you can do and all the tools to track that. So it's really about breaking it down. It's not about making complex predictions for the end user.
Right, right. No, which is, I think, the first step at it, right? And I think it is super important, right? It gives you hyper personalized information. For example, you've, done a blood test and your iron levels are low. Like, this would basically essentially tell you, like, hey, like maybe incorporate some leafy greens that are high in iron, to supplement that, or maybe give you some sort of supplement recommendations, you know.
Yeah, but there are complications in that. Imagine, like, I'll give you an example with vitamin D. Um, I once did a blood test from one at-home testing provider here in the US, and I got a result that my vitamin D is a bit lower. It was during the winter, and like
Right,
during the winter, one half of the whole population has it kind of low, because we
right.
get it from the
Sun.
sun. And and the recommendation, I was supposed to get personalized recommendations. But you know what I got? I just got a paragraph of text which was determined by only a single set of if-else conditions in something
Right,
like if I were to explain some like pseudocode, like
right,
if you have low vitamin D, then display the user this paragraph. If you have it
right.
good, then display this. If you have it high, display that. And what does the paragraph say? Is it really personalized? If it were personalized, it would probably need to take into account my dietary preferences, because, for example, the paragraph was saying, try to eat more oily fish, and other like natural sources, or like fish oil contains, vitamins. But what if I'm vegan or vegetarian,
Correct.
or try to spend more time in the sun, but if you live in the south somewhere, like near the equator, then try to,
Yeah.
like get a sunscreen. But what if I really have high risk of getting skin cancer, genetically predisposed, So there are so many variables, and I know why it's hard, and why I know why these companies are not building it, because it's DTech. If you think about it, just adding up 5 factors like these, like your skin cancer risk, if you're what's your basically BMI, because overweight people need more vitamin D, like that. What's your actual vitamin D levels? What are your historic vitamin D levels? Dietary preferences. It's all adds up, and it creates thousands of combinations. So it's not a simple if-else condition which you can build on top of that. And I think that a lot of people are kind of like, health washed, if I were to like use, like
Totally.
parallel to the like greenwashing, that they are getting personalized stuff, but it's actually not personalized at all. I'm getting a paragraph of a generic article, which is
Totally.
telling me, yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean, somewhere some of the failure in the medical system is also like that, right? A doctor will check you across just one biomarker and then give you a diagnosis, because that costs the insurance company a lot less and it's just more convenient, right? And the fact that you're looking
Mm,
at, go ahead.
Depends on the system, right? Depends
This,
on the system. There
right,
are systems in the world where actually doctors, there are systems which incentivize doctors to over prescribe you diagnostic methods because they get paid more easily. And then there are
totally.
systems where trying to optimize that efficiency, but at the expense that something like you said might happen. The US
Right,
system overall is more biased towards over prescribing diagnostics and making sure that you are measured completely so that they can actually get the money from your insurance company which will pay you. The European system is more publicly funded,
right,
in a way. There's no co-payment mostly from the people. So a lot of people sometimes get like hypochondriacs often get care which they probably don't need. So there's probably some middle ground which probably holds the truth, you know. But yeah, like this can obviously happen. But overall, you know, I would say that like the current healthcare system is really reactive, you know, focused, reactive focused. But
Right.
I'm not really a big fan of startups saying that they are disrupting the healthcare, because I think we should really be thankful, and I think it would be kind of disrespectful to say that we're disrupting the work. If you see that like what like great amount of work had to be done by the whole healthcare system during, for example, the COVID pandemic, you can see that it's actually functioning really well in that field, you know, and we should be respectful for it. To be not saying that we're disrupting it, but we're optimizing it, we're supercharging it with new technologies. And that's where we're exactly living. We're starting with the end user, you know, as the first entry point. But our future would be also, you know, more focused on helping GPs and insurance companies. But we want to, you know, build it fast, and that's why
Right.
we are entering the market with something which doesn't actually need FDA approvals at first.
Right. And I guess, each country or each continent kind of has their own challenges with their healthcare system, right? Spending a decent amount of time in the US, I just realized that the American healthcare system comes with so many challenges. And, I feel like, in a way, I do believe that, yes, you are optimizing it in a way, but I think that optimization is a major disruption, because the traditional healthcare system is just caught up by admin. There's, like, just look at the healthcare bill in America. Fracture your leg in America and fracture your leg, let's say, in Prague. Or forget it, Canada. The bill's gonna be like 10x of even 20x in the US. Like, it's like a death sentence to be admitted in a hospital in the US. And the fact that you are kind of giving users the data on their hand is leverage, where they don't have to wait for the end moment to take action, which in effect basically makes the healthcare system more sustainable and more cost effective, you know uh, which is incredible.
Yeah, in the long run, for sure. Another example of fracturing your leg, you know, actually, when my friend went skiing, you know, and 2 weeks ago, and unfortunately, he did hurt and fracture his leg, and it cost him zero in co-payments in Europe. So actually, that's incredible, right? But in a way, you know, the systems just work differently, you know. Yeah, here in the US, we know that it can
Yeah.
really be a death sentence in, like, you know, especially to your personal finance. And um, but that's how it's built here. And I would call it, I, I think it's an overstatement to call the US healthcare system actually a system. You know, it's like a collection of different solutions, um, which kind of work together, but really, like, large reforms are needed. But we're luckily, you know, as I said, we are first entering the market with more like wellness oriented solution, which is informed by your data, which you can store in the long run, so that we can actually help where it's most needed right now. Because what the system, or if we don't call it system, never mind, you know, like, what it really cannot do is preventively and proactively watch out for you and give you the time you need to understand everything. Yeah, if you were to ask anybody, do you know your health status? People would be like, maybe, you know, or I'm not
Right.
sure, you know, or like, yeah,
Right.
my doctor said
S-
it's okay, or something like that.
yeah. Right. So, I want to get into a little bit of the technical aspect of it, right? So, you said you used a system prehistorically that, which gave you a diagnosis of vitamin D. It didn't take account to your environment, your dietary restrictions. And, from like a coder's perspective or pseudocode perspective, it makes sense. It's basically a logical if else statement, right? Like, generative AI, huge boom. Every organization is implementing LLMs into their models, into their algorithms. Uh, Talk about training your like the benefits that I don't know if you guys use LLMs, but talk about how you view LLMs, how you view generative AI as part of that solution of giving a more holistic diagnosis or a more holistic healthcare professional advice.
Yeah, like, one might think that the recommendation could be created by an LLM, but the issue is that so far you're not really sure if in like all of these thousands of combinations, you're not gonna get some hallucination or some kind of recommendation which you are communicating in a way which isn't the right way, for your app positioning, or too medical or not too medical or something like that, or use a different tone. A lot of that can be supplemented by prompting, but it's just, too risky, to be creating like a chatbot to ask your medical questions. And companies are moving away from that, and the big companies are like really, really um, um, trying to position themselves so that they don't have to be in that field yet. And what we are doing, we are using LLMs, but we're building a unique layer above that, which utilizes a lot of different AI agents to help us to optimize and like very um like speed up the training of very simple, like, models which we pre-train based on that, which are capable of like answering one specific question based on the combination of the factors very deterministically, and with reinforcement learning from actual health coaches and doctors from our team or our contractors. So that's why how we are reinventing the whole field, where we are the ones who are able to provide you based on these set of factors to provide you truly personalized recommendation, which does not come just from prompting an LLM, and at the same time it has been checked by a doctor.
Awesome. That's interesting. So you guys are using agents to kind of verify it, and then you have a human in the loop also to ensure that the output is correct.
Yeah,
That's awesome.
it's
So
like it works along like statistics and combinations and similarity, where if you think about it, if you have like 10 factors, different 100, 50,000, let's say 50,000 combinations, then obviously not all of these combinations will be technically valid. And if you look at the population distribution of different of these factors, then there are really like statistic outliers. For example, something totally simple, like imagine like a dietary composition, there will be very few people who are, I don't know, eating only imagine something which would be a valid mathematical combination but would be totally impractical, somebody who's eating only leafy greens the whole day, which is unsustainable, and somebody on the
right.
other side who's eating only meat, something like that. So these are like kind of like all the combinations which you can cut out from that. So that's how we're also able to optimize that, so that we don't have to, that the humans actually don't have to check all the hundreds of thousands of combinations while still making sure that the confidence of each of the recommendation is high enough that it can be offered to the user without being afraid that we're not providing some misleading guidance.
Totally. I mean, this is awesome. I love the mission you guys are on. Uh, I know that you guys are giving early access to Macromo. Like, how are people supposed to use this app? How can people, start putting all of their data into Macromo and, start getting healthcare advice?
Yeah, we're right now few weeks from launching in the US in this early access fashion. We started already prototyping, and basically as a very lean startup, we started in Europe. The biggest markets which we already like, launched and our customers were in were Switzerland, Portugal, Spain, and Czech Republic. And we created like all the atomic parts of the whole service, and we supplemented and track a lot of the techniques which we are going to transform into digital features using humans. So we're basically having people taking at-home tests and people attending programs, structured programs with human health coaches or just simple Zoom calls and taking notes so that we could really, really understand the problem. In the process of that, just in the first year, we had a great success. And as a small startup with, a few team members, we were able to make 500,000 in revenue up to this year, 400,000 of that in the last year only, the first year, which we started doing that. So from all of these pieces, there's like the really true early access with really an unfinished app yet was already available in Europe. But now we're transforming all that we learned, and all the hypotheses lead us towards believing that all the problems we were solving for people in Europe are so much more bigger and exaggerated um, in the US. So there's going to be a much bigger market and also a great amount of communities to start with, which are focused on longevity and health lifestyle. So we're going to first go into these communities and start from there, getting first early adopters. And what people can expect an app where they can easily go. And we're using automation as the main pinnacle of all we're building. So we're just trying to simplify your health tracking as much as possible. You're just connecting all your different health data sources. You can just easily take a photo of your existing blood test records or import PDFs or link through some web portals to your medical records. We will gather this data, securely store it in an anonymized way for you, and then we will be creating the recommendations in a feed. You can think about it like everybody's subscribed to some kind of a feed about all different topics like tech or I don't know hardware startups they are interested into, but we never really get a feed about our health which would be really talking to us like if a health coach would be here and now with us all the time. So that's what people can expect from the very first version we will be releasing here in the US.
Awesome. So I'm gonna put the link to your website down below, so people can check it out and let me know once it's out there. I'm definitely gonna try it out. I'm super excited to see what Macromo does, and thank you so much for coming on the platform, Peter. I guess what's your last word of advice for some young kid entrepreneur just like yourself at one point that wants to get into deep tech, that wants to get into hardware? How would you encourage them from stopping them going into finance or like building a regular old CRM startup?
Well, I think you need to start somewhere. Like there is um I think you know I heard and read somewhere about the term like product founder fit. That you really have to be doing something you totally love, and I think yeah, that's true. You need to enjoy doing what you love, but you're like once you ship something out, the waves are gonna steer you in a direction where you actually didn't even intend it to be in the first place, So maybe you'll end up doing something different at all. So you need to like the process, It's about, really like being into all of that. And you need to start, you need to ship, So I would encourage everyone to don't wait and just go and ship whatever product you're building. If it's hardware, find a place, find a space or build it or travel, somewhere where you can build it. If it's software, then start working right away and get your first consumers as soon as possible. Even if you were to really do it a manual way like we did, with like contracting health coaches and, shipping the first at home test kits from our own office. Uh, uh, just try to find ways to really make sure that what you're trying to solve is a real issue, but don't worry that much, because, you know, you'll fail and I failed too, uh, I failed so many times and I just want to keep on trying and bring something which is gonna help this world and what keeps me going, and I like
Right.
doing it. So
Right. A true builder's journey is repetitive iteration until the product succeeds. Awesome. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. It was so interesting to talk to you. It's very rare that I personally come across people like you. So wish you the best of luck for your journey in Macromo,
thank you.
and maybe I'll talk to you a couple of years from now when you guys have really put a dent in healthcare.
Yeah, looking forward to it. Thanks a lot for inviting me. It was really nice talk. Thanks a lot.
Awesome. Okay, this was great. So I'm gonna just stop it now. Thank you so much, man. Really appreciate